You think you know what a hard life looks like? You don't. These people had childhood famines carved into their teeth, injuries that should have killed them, and something discovered last year that's darker than anything in the textbooks. Here's what this video is actually about. The real daily horror of being a Neanderthal. Not the cartoon grunt and club version, not the gentle misunderstood cousin version either. The actual bone-level evidence of what their lives felt like. And there's one thing buried near the end of this video that almost nobody talks about. Something discovered just last year that changes how dark this whole story really is. Keep that in mind as we go. Now, the conventional take is that Neanderthals were uniquely violent and brutal, more so than us. That idea has been floating around for decades, and almost every documentary repeats it. But here's where it gets interesting. Researchers previously thought that Neanderthal lives were far more nasty, brutish, and short than ancient Homo sapiens, based mainly on studies looking at levels of injury among both groups. The problem was the comparison group. Previous claims stemmed from studies that compared Neanderthal remains to the remains of more recently alive Homo sapiens. But a team of German scientists took a different approach. They compared Neanderthal injuries to those of Upper Paleolithic anatomically modern humans, a group that shared similar environments and lived a similar hunter-gatherer lifestyle, making them a far more suitable comparison. And the result? Both Neanderthals and Homo sapiens living in the Ice Age sustained similar levels of head trauma. They weren't uniquely violent. The whole Ice Age was hell for everyone in it. Life between 40,000 and 50,000 years ago was dangerous for all. The whole era was a slaughterhouse. We just blamed one species for the weather. So no, the brutality wasn't theirs alone. But that doesn't mean they weren't suffering. Because when you actually read what their bones recorded, and bones record everything, what you find is genuinely hard to sit with. Start with the teeth. Neanderthal tooth enamel preserves growth lines, and those lines freeze the exact moments a body stopped developing from starvation. You can read childhood famines in the enamel of someone who died 50,000 years ago. The winters that nearly killed them as children are still there, written in calcium, waiting to be read. Growth interruptions cluster around weaning and early adolescence, the two moments when food security was most fragile. These weren't occasional hard years. For many of them, near starvation was a recurring feature of growing up. And the skeleton situation is just as grim. A high frequency of antemortem trauma associated with the survival of the injured individuals appears to have been characteristic of the Neanderthals. We're not talking about minor injuries. We're talking about shattered skulls, broken limbs, wounds that took months to heal, and then healed, because the person kept living. The typical well-preserved Neanderthal skeleton is basically a patched-together record of things that should have ended them. Their weapons couldn't kill from a distance, which meant hunting involved getting dangerously close to enormous, angry animals. And the bone damage reflects exactly that. Head and upper body injuries dominate the record in a pattern consistent with close-range confrontations with large prey. The kind of damage you'd expect from someone who had to physically grapple with something that weighed several times what they did. Now, you may have heard the comparison to rodeo riders. It's one of the most repeated facts in every Neanderthal video out there. But that specific claim has been challenged by later reanalysis, with researchers pointing out the comparison doesn't hold up cleanly once the data is properly corrected and set against sapiens. Here's something that makes the injury picture even more complicated, though. There's a Neanderthal found in Shanidar cave in Iraqi Kurdistan. Researchers nicknamed him Nandi, and his skeleton is one of the most remarkable things in the entire fossil record. His skeleton bears the scars of an eye socket crushed beyond repair, a withered right arm, and severe damage to his right leg, likely sustained during his youth. He also suffered a progressive deterioration and loss of his hearing. Based on the healing of his injuries, Shanidar I lived with them for a substantial time before his death. Think about what that actually means. His deafness would have made him easy prey for the ubiquitous carnivores in his environment, and dependent on other members of his social group for survival. According to paleoanthropologist Eric Trinkhaus, Shanidar I must have been aided by others in order to survive his injuries. Due to the chronic effects of trauma, it was unlikely that this individual could independently provide for his family, so his post-injury lifespan may imply that he was kept alive due to his high social status or valuable cultural knowledge. Someone fed him. Someone protected him. In a world that was actively trying to kill everyone, they made room for a man who couldn't pull his weight. That's not brutishness. That's something else entirely. And speaking of what they understood about their own bodies, there was a teenage Neanderthal found at El Cedron in Spain who had a painful jaw abscess and a gut parasite. In his hardened plaque, researchers found two things: poplar, which contains the active ingredient in aspirin, and penicillium, the mold that gives us penicillin. They say he appears to have been self-medicating, though they can't prove it with certainty. But the match between what he was consuming and the specific illnesses he had is striking enough that it's hard to write off as coincidence. 40,000 years before we synthesized these compounds in a lab, someone may have been using the natural versions of both. There's also a rib fragment from Krapina, Croatia, a young male, roughly 120,000 years old, that carries a benign bone tumor. It's one of the oldest tumors ever identified in the fossil record, beating the next oldest by more than 100,000 years. Now, here's where the video shifts. Because everything I've told you so far, they suffered by accident. The hunger, the injuries, the illness. What comes next, they did on purpose. In a cave in Belgium called Goyet, researchers found Neanderthal bones mixed in with horse and reindeer remains. Same cut marks, same percussion damage, same bones cracked open for marrow. Excavators discovered 101 Neanderthal bone fragments, many of which had butchery marks similar to those on animal bones, suggesting someone had killed and eaten them. And then some of those human bones were repurposed, turned into tools for retouching stone blades. Now, Neanderthal cannibalism has been documented at other sites, so that part alone isn't new. What's new is what a November 2025 study found when researchers went back to the Goyet collection with modern DNA analysis, isotopic measurements, and radiocarbon dating. Analysis of Neanderthal bones from Goyet indicates selective cannibalism mainly targeting women and children from non-local groups between 41,000 and 45,000 years ago. The bones belonged to 4 adult women and 2 male children, and the women were shorter and more slender than the average female Neanderthal. When researchers combined their findings with isotopic analysis of the remains, they concluded that the cannibalized Neanderthals came from a completely different region than the one they died in. These weren't members of the local group. They were outsiders, brought in from elsewhere, processed like prey. This transforms the interpretation from possible endocannibalism, eating members of one's own group, to exocannibalism, the consumption of outsiders, typically associated with warfare and intergroup violence. Such cannibalism directed at specific outsiders could reflect the existence of territorial tensions between groups that preceded the disappearance of Neanderthals in the region. And the researchers note they can't say with certainty whether the perpetrators were other Neanderthals or early modern humans, which somehow makes it worse, not better. Remember that open question from the beginning. The thing that changes how dark this story is? That's it. That's a level of organized intergroup violence that most people don't associate with Neanderthals at all. And yet, and this is the part that keeps the whole story from collapsing into pure horror, they also used medicinal plants and had complex social structures that included burying their dead. While one group in Belgium was processing outsiders like livestock, other groups were laying their dead to rest intact, with apparent care and intention. Same species, same era. Cannibals and undertakers existing in parallel. The Neanderthal world wasn't one thing. It was everything at once, the worst of what a social species can do, and the best, running side by side across tens of thousands of years. So here's where we landed. Neanderthals weren't uniquely violent. The whole Ice Age was brutal for everyone. But their lives were still full of real suffering. Childhood famines written into their teeth, injuries that would have been career-ending for most modern people. Diseases we only recently learned to treat, and in at least one documented case, organized predatory violence against outsiders. And yet running through all of it is evidence of care. A deaf, one-armed, partially blind man kept alive by his group, a teenager self-medicating with plants that worked, communities burying their dead with what looks a lot like grief. That tension between the horror and the humanity is what makes Neanderthals genuinely fascinating. Not as a simpler, dumber version of us, as a version of us that faced the same darkness, and sometimes, against all odds, chose to look after each other anyway. If you want to go deeper on what actually separated Neanderthals from Homo sapiens, the biology, the brain differences, the real reasons one species made it and the other didn't, that video is right here. And if this one surprised you even once, drop a comment with which fact hit hardest. The Belgium one tends to win, but the Aspirin detail is a quiet contender. Subscribe if you want more of this kind of thing. We go deep on the history that doesn't make the textbooks.